It started with a knock at the door. A small, seemingly unremarkable parcel sat on the front porch. I hadn't expected it to arrive so soon. Inside the box was what I had been searching for, my prize. The final piece to complete my antique doll collection. This doll was different from the others. It was life-sized, with porcelain skin so pale it almost looked translucent. The intricate lace dress it wore had yellowed with age, and its glass eyes gleamed an unsettling shade of blue, almost too lifelike. I'd heard the stories about it, the whispers that followed it through every auction and private sale, rumors of strange occurrences, of bad luck, of hauntings, but I didn't care about superstitions. It was the crown jewel of my collection. As I stood it up in the corner of my living room, it almost seemed to watch me. I brushed off the feeling. It was just an old doll, after all. That night, the house felt different. A chill seemed to hang in the air, the kind that settled deep into your bones. But it wasn't until later that I started hearing the noises. It began with the sound of soft footsteps, faint but unmistakable, echoing through the halls. I ignored it at first, convincing myself it was the house settling. But when the sound grew louder, more deliberate, I couldn't deny it any longer. The footsteps weren't random, they were coming toward me. I grabbed a flashlight, the beam flickering as I moved down the hallway. The air was thick, stifling. Each step echoed, and I found myself holding my breath, listening. Something was wrong. As I passed the display room where my dolls were kept, I froze. The door was open. I never left that door open. Inside, the dolls sat in their usual positions on the shelves, their glass eyes reflecting the dim light. Except something was off. I scanned the room, trying to figure out what it was. Then it hit me. One of the dolls was missing. I swallowed hard, feeling a knot form in my throat. The missing doll. It was the life-sized one, the one I'd just brought home. My pulse quickened as I slowly backed out of the room. The creaking of the floorboards behind me sent a jolt of fear straight to my core. I spun around, the flashlight shaking in my hand. Standing at the end of the hallway, half shrouded in shadow, was the doll, but it wasn't where I'd left it. It was standing on its own. My heart pounded in my chest as I took a step back, but my feet felt like they were sinking into the floor. The doll's glassy blue eyes stared at me, unblinking. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. Then, without warning, its head tilted just slightly. A creak, slow and deliberate. The sound scraped against my nerves like nails on a chalkboard. I bolted. My mind screamed at me to get out, but as I raced down the stairs, the shadows seemed to twist and move, as though the house itself were alive, closing in around me. The walls felt too tight, too close. The air hummed with something sinister, something unseen. I reached the front door, yanking it open with a desperate gasp. But before I could step outside, the door slammed shut on its own, the force throwing me back into the hallway. I scrambled to my feet, my pulse hammering in my ears, and then I heard it. The sound that made my blood run cold. Laughter. Not the laughter of a child or even a person. It was high-pitched, broken like a cracked music box. It echoed through the halls, coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. I spun around, searching for the source, but there was nothing. Nothing except the doll. The life-sized figure was no longer at the top of the stairs. It was standing right in front of me. Its glassy eyes glinted in the dim light. And for a moment, I could have sworn its mouth had twisted into a grin. A sharp pain shot through my leg as I felt something pull me down. I looked down in horror. One of the smaller dolls from my collection had wrapped its tiny porcelain hands around my ankle. Its grip was impossibly strong, its face twisted into a grotesque expression. I kicked it away, stumbling back. But they kept coming. From every shadow, every corner, the dolls emerged. Dozens of them. Their glass eyes reflecting the fear on my face, their tiny hands reaching, clawing. I turned, my breath catching in my throat as I saw the life-size doll move. It was no longer still. It took a step forward, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet with invisible strings. The closer it got, the heavier the air became, suffocating me with an overwhelming sense of dread. Then it spoke, but it wasn't a voice. It was a whisper, sharp, hissing, yet somehow familiar. "We're coming." The last thing I remember before the darkness swallowed me whole was the doll's cold, lifeless hand reaching out toward my face, and the sound of more footsteps. I woke up in darkness. My head pounded, and a sharp pain throbbed in my leg where the doll had grabbed me. For a moment, I thought it had all been a nightmare, but as my eyes adjusted to the gloom, the cold, suffocating air pressed down on me, and I knew it was real. The house was silent. Too silent. I struggled to my feet, wincing as my ankle gave way under the weight. The house felt different now, as if it had shifted in some unexplainable way. It was no longer familiar. The walls seemed taller, stretching into shadows that weren't there before. The air was thick with a sense of malice, as though the house itself was watching me. I needed to leave. I limped toward the front door, praying it would open this time. But before I could reach it, the door creaked and I froze. Slowly, it swung open on its own. I backed away, dread creeping up my spine. And then, the doll stepped inside. It moved differently now, smoother, more deliberate. Its head jerked to the side, and for a split second, I could have sworn I saw a flicker of life behind those glassy eyes. It didn't belong here. It didn't belong anywhere. And yet there it was, standing in my doorway as if it owned the place. Behind it, more shadows stirred. The smaller dolls crept forward, their tiny feet tapping against the floor like a rain of death. They fanned out, circling me like predators closing in on their prey. I turned and ran. I didn't care where, just away from them. My heartbeat pounded in my ears as I threw myself into the nearest room and slammed the door behind me. My hands shook as I locked it, the old wood groaning under the sudden pressure. I collapsed against the wall, gasping for breath, trying to steady myself. My mind raced. I needed to find that cursed doll, the one that had started all of this. I'd heard stories about haunted dolls before, but nothing had prepared me for this. Somehow it was the key. If I could destroy it, maybe, just maybe, I could stop this nightmare. I forced myself to stand, gripping the flashlight tighter as I surveyed the room. It was the dining room, but now it felt like a tomb. The heavy curtains were drawn, blocking out any sign of life from outside. The only light came from the flashlight's narrow beam, slicing through the darkness like a blade. Then something shifted in the corner. I swung the flashlight around, and the beam landed on the life-size doll. It was sitting at the head of the dining table, its hands folded neatly in its lap. But something was different. Its eyes were no longer glassy and lifeless. They gleamed in the darkness with a malevolent intelligence, tracking my every movement. I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat. The doll didn't move. It just stared. And then slowly, impossibly, its mouth began to open. A voice, hollow and cold, spilled out into the room. "You can't stop us." The door behind me rattled violently, and I spun around just as the smaller dolls began clawing their way through. Their porcelain faces were twisted into horrifying smiles, their tiny hands reaching, scratching at the wood, trying to break through. I looked back at the life-size doll, but it was gone. The chair at the head of the table was empty. Panic surged through me. I needed to get out of this room, out of this house, but the door was no longer an option. The dolls were coming, swarming like an unstoppable tide. My only hope was the window. I ran to it, tearing the heavy curtains aside, but when I looked out, my heart sank. The sky outside was wrong. It was too dark, too black. No moon, no stars. Just an endless void. And in that void, I could see faint shapes moving, twisting, watching. I was trapped. The door behind me burst open with a crash, and the dolls flooded in. I grabbed the nearest chair and swung it, trying to keep them back. But for every one I knocked away, two more took its place. Their tiny hands clawed at me, cold and sharp like knives. And then I felt it. Cold fingers on the back of my neck. I froze. Slowly, I turned around. The life-size doll was standing right behind me, so close I could feel its breath, if it had breath, against my skin. Its glassy blue eyes were inches from my face, and for the first time I noticed something. Those eyes, they weren't glass anymore. They were real. Before I could react, the doll's hand shot out, grabbing me by the throat with an impossible strength. I struggled, gasping for air as it lifted me off the ground with ease. Its face twisted into a grotesque smile, and in that moment I knew this was no ordinary doll. There was something inside it, something ancient, something evil. The room spun as the air was forced from my lungs. The dolls below me chattered, their laughter filling my ears like the sound of broken glass. And then, just as the darkness began to close in, the life-size doll leaned in, its voice a whisper in my ear. "You'll never leave." With a final burst of strength, I lashed out, kicking at the doll's face. Its head snapped back with a sickening crack, and it dropped me. I hit the floor hard, gasping for breath. But as I scrambled to my feet, the doll's head slowly turned back to face me. The crack in its porcelain skin spread, revealing something beneath, something darker, something alive. And it smiled. I bolted out of the room, my mind racing. I didn't know how much longer I could hold out, but I had to find the cursed doll. It was the only way to stop this nightmare. But as I fled down the hall, the walls seemed to close in, shifting and twisting like the dolls themselves were reshaping the house around me. I wasn't just running from them anymore. I was running from the house. The walls groaned as if they were alive, shifting and contorting like the house itself was breathing. I could hear the dolls behind me, their tiny feet scurrying along the floor, chasing me through the labyrinth my home had become. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat louder than the last, but I couldn't stop now. I bolted down a hallway that shouldn't have been there. The house was changing, warping with every step I took. The wallpaper peeled, the lights flickered, and the air reeked of decay. It was as if the house was feeding off my fear, growing more twisted with each passing second. I reached what looked like the living room, but nothing was right. The furniture was covered in thick layers of dust that hadn't been there before. The windows were boarded up from the inside, sealing me in this nightmare. My only hope was to find that cursed doll, the one responsible for all of this. As I scanned the room, something caught my eye. In the far corner, half hidden in shadow, stood the glass cabinet where I kept the rarest pieces of my collection. The life-size doll wasn't there, but its place had been filled with something else. A small, weathered box sat on the top shelf, almost glowing in the dim light. My pulse quickened. That had to be it, the source of all of this. I rushed toward it, but before I could reach the cabinet, the floor beneath me buckled and I crashed to the ground. I hit the floor hard. The wind knocked out of me. I tried to scramble back to my feet, but something cold wrapped around my ankle, yanking me backward. I twisted around and my stomach dropped. The dolls had found me. They dragged themselves toward me, their twisted faces grinning in the dark. One of the smaller ones had latched onto my leg, its porcelain hands gripping my ankle like a vice. I kicked at it, desperate to free myself, but it only tightened its hold. The other dolls joined in, crawling over one another to reach me, their lifeless eyes glinting with malice. I screamed, thrashing against them, but they were relentless. Their cold, sharp fingers tore at my skin, dragging me down into the darkness they had created. And then, just as I thought it was over, I heard it again. Laughter. That high-pitched, broken laughter. I turned my head and there it was, standing at the entrance to the room. The life-size doll. But this time it wasn't alone. Behind it I saw the shadows shift and move, forming into shapes that weren't quite human. They loomed over the doll, their faces distorted, their eyes black and empty. They weren't just dolls anymore. They were something else. Something worse. The life-size doll stepped forward, dragging the shadows with it. I watched in horror as it raised one hand, pointing directly at me. Its voice was no longer a whisper. It was a command. Take it. The shadows surged forward, swallowing the room in darkness. I could feel them closing in, suffocating me with their cold, unnatural presence. I kicked and screamed, but it was no use. The dolls clung to me, their porcelain faces pressing against mine, their sharp fingers digging into my skin. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. All I could do was watch as the shadows wrapped around me, pulling me into the void. And then the lights flickered. For a brief second, the room lit up again, and in that moment I saw it, the cursed doll. It was there, inside the glass cabinet, staring back at me with those cold, dead eyes. I didn't know how, but I had to get to it. It was the only way to stop this madness. With every ounce of strength I had left, I pushed myself up, tearing free from the grip of the smaller dolls. They screeched and clawed at me, but I didn't care. I had to reach that cabinet. I stumbled forward, my legs shaking beneath me. The shadows swirled around, trying to pull me back, but I wouldn't let them. I reached the cabinet, throwing it open with trembling hands. The cursed doll stared up at me, its face frozen in a twisted smile. Without thinking, I grabbed it, my fingers curling around its fragile neck. The moment I touched it, a wave of cold washed over me, like the life was being sucked out of me. But I held on, squeezing tighter, trying to crush it, trying to end this nightmare once and for all. The room began to shake, the walls groaning and cracking as the dolls screamed. The life-size doll stood still, its head tilted, watching me with those unnatural eyes. But then something changed. As I squeezed the cursed doll, its porcelain face began to crack. Hairline fractures spread across its cheeks, and I could hear a faint, echoing whisper, like a voice trapped inside the doll, begging to be freed. I squeezed harder, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The room grew darker, the shadows closing in. The whispers turned into screams, desperate, pleading screams. And then the doll's head shattered. The instant it broke, the shadows recoiled, pulling back as if they had been burned. The dolls that had been clawing at me fell to the ground, lifeless, their glass eyes empty once again. The life-size doll wavered, its body twitching violently as if fighting to stay in control. For a moment, I thought it was over. But then the life-size doll looked at me, its mouth twisting into that sickening smile once more. "You've only begun to understand," it hissed. The ground beneath me opened up, swallowing me into the dark. And as I fell, I realized the truth. I hadn't destroyed the curse. I had unleashed it. I woke up to silence. My body was heavy, every limb weighed down by exhaustion and pain. The darkness was gone, replaced by a soft, warm light filtering through the windows. For a moment, I couldn't remember where I was or what had happened. The memories came rushing back. The cursed doll, the life-sized one, the shadows, and the terror that had gripped my house. But now everything was still. I slowly sat up, looking around. I was in my living room. The furniture was exactly where it should be. The windows were no longer boarded up, and the walls had returned to their normal, familiar state. It was as if none of it had ever happened. But I knew it had. I could still feel the lingering chill, the remnants of the nightmare I'd survived. My heart pounded as I scanned the room, expecting to see the dolls, the shadows, something. But there was nothing. The cabinet stood open, its shelves bare. Every single doll was gone, even the cursed one. I stood up, my legs unsteady beneath me, and moved cautiously toward the cabinet. I reached out, running my fingers over the glass, half expecting something to leap out at me. But the cabinet was empty. The cursed doll, destroyed, shattered, had somehow taken everything with it. A part of me wanted to believe it was over, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. I had seen too much. I had heard too much. And the life-size doll's final words echoed in my mind. "You've only begun to understand." I stepped away from the cabinet, my eyes drifting toward the front door. It was wide open, the cool autumn breeze blowing softly into the room. I should have been terrified. An open door after what I had just gone through should have filled me with dread. But instead, I felt a strange sense of peace, like the nightmare had passed and I had emerged from the darkness. As I walked toward the door, I noticed something on the floor. It was small and glimmered in the light. I knelt down and picked it up. A tiny, shattered piece of porcelain, the last fragment of the cursed doll. I stared at it, turning it over in my hand. It was cold to the touch, but there was no power left in it, no sense of the malevolent energy that had once consumed my home. The curse had truly been broken. I didn't know how I could be so sure, but I felt it deep inside me. The dolls, the shadows, the terror, they were gone for good. I stood up, holding the porcelain shard in my hand as I stepped outside. The air was crisp, the sky a brilliant shade of blue, and the street was quiet. Nothing out of the ordinary. It was Halloween, but now it felt like a normal, peaceful day. I looked down at the piece of porcelain one last time before tossing it into the wind. The fragment disappeared, carried away by the breeze as if it had never existed. The weight that had been pressing down on me for so long finally lifted. I took a deep breath, savoring the fresh air. The nightmare was over. I was free. Later that evening, as the sun set and the sky turned a deep orange, I lit a fire in the fireplace and settled onto the couch. I had locked all the doors, not out of fear, but because I knew this was my home again. The terror that had haunted these walls was gone. I glanced around the room one last time, expecting a shadow, a noise, something. But there was only the comforting crackle of the fire and the soft glow of the embers. I smiled, realizing that, for the first time in days, I felt truly safe. The curse had been destroyed, and with it, the dolls that had sought to replace me. They were gone, banished to whatever dark place they had come from. The house was mine again. As Halloween night drew to a close, I lay back, letting the warmth of the fire lull me to sleep. The fear was gone, the curse was broken, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, peace had returned. I slept soundly, knowing that the nightmare was finally over. The dolls would never come back, and I was free.